Hey everybody, Steve here in Richmond, Virginia at Hollywood Cemetery, and I'm standing here in front of the final resting place, the crypt of President James Monroe. And right behind him, this obelisk here, this is the monument to President John Tyler. So they're both laid to rest here right next to each other. It's called President's Circle. And I know there have been a couple of other presidents who are buried in cemeteries with other presidents. Kennedy and Taft are laid to rest in Arlington, Virginia. The Adamses are laid to rest in the same cemetery. We're just, 30, 40 feet away from each other.
John F. Kennedy and William Howard Taft were both military veterans, so it's not a big surprise that they're both buried not very far from each other at Arlington National Cemetery. And John Adams and John Quincy Adams were father and son, so it's not a surprise that they're buried next to each other with their wives and first ladies at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts. But being here today, my first thought was, why are Monroe and Tyler buried here together? Well, after doing a little bit of research, I discovered that in the 1850s, there was a movement to relocate the remains of all the presidents born in Virginia to Hollywood Cemetery here in Richmond, Virginia. 8 U.S. presidents were born here in Virginia, and 7 U.S. presidents are buried here in Virginia. But in the end, the only 2 presidents who were buried here were Monroe and Tyler. After leaving the White House, Monroe was reportedly bankrupt, and when he died in 1831, he was broke and buried in a New York City cemetery. Decades later, his family did agree to allow his body to be removed and reinterred here in a much nicer grave. Tyler died in 1862 and was also laid to rest here. At least now I know why these 2 presidents are buried here together.
And they're both here facing the James River. You have a very beautiful spot. So even though this isn't a presidential library, or they're not laid to rest on their estates or anything, these are still very, very impressive final resting places. And it's surprising how close you can get to their grave sites. A lot of the presidents, you can't get very close to their grave sites. So these you can get right up to their grave sites. James Monroe was a very popular president in his time. He was elected twice to office. He was born very wealthy and died very poor. But as you can see, this gravesite here, this final resting place in President's Circle, is definitely not a poor man's grave. A very beautiful final resting place. It's called the birdcage because it looks like a birdcage, Victorian era birdcage, I guess. And he is only one of 3 presidents who died on July 4th.
He was born on April 28, 1758, in Monroe Hall, Virginia, and died July 4, 1831, in New York City, at the age of 73. His cause of death was heart failure and tuberculosis. He was the 5th U.S. president and also one of the founding fathers. And in an interesting bit of trivia, he was the very last U.S. president to never have been photographed during his lifetime. And his gravesite here is a National Historic Landmark.
And not only is this a beautiful, I guess you would call it a crypt or tomb. I believe tombs are underground, so I guess this would be a crypt. I mean, it's early morning, the sun is just coming up, so it's not very bright, but it looks like it's going to be a beautiful day today. Now, as loved and admired as James Monroe was as a president, the other president buried here in this cemetery was one of the most hated presidents of all time. And the reason is that he supported the Confederacy. And as you know, in the Civil War, the Confederates lost. So he was pretty much disgraced and shunned for much of the rest of his life, except among fellow Confederates. I was surprised to see these wreaths here this morning. Very fresh wreaths. Looks like they just were placed in the last day or 2. And how nice that they're placing wreaths like this here all these years later. I mean, he died in 1831. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's so neat that presidents and other famous people are remembered like this long after they were gone. And what is this wreath? Who placed this wreath? It says First Families of Virginia.
So let's walk over to President Tyler's gravesite now. He was the 10th U.S. president, and he served from 1841 to 1845. And he wasn't popular with voters or his party. And he was the very first person who became president without being elected. He was William Henry Harrison's vice president, and when Harrison unexpectedly died just a month into his presidency, Tyler became president. But even that was very controversial because it had never happened before. The law wasn't very clear about what should happen in a case like this, so Tyler just claimed that he was president rather than acting president, and everyone just kind of went along with it, setting a precedent for future vice presidents who succeeded their predecessors after death. This has happened now a total of 8 times. He was also the first U.S. president to actively help in the attempt to overthrow the American government. He was seen as a traitor to the country because he sided with and supported the Confederate States in their attempt to divide the nation, which led to the Civil War. The inscription on his headstone reads,
John Tyler, President of the United States, 1841 to 1845, born in Charles City County, Virginia, March 29th, 1790, died in the city of Richmond, January 18th, 1862.
Because he was considered to be a traitor to the country, his death was not acknowledged by the U.S. government. He's the only president so far whose coffin was not draped with an American flag. Instead of being draped with an American flag, he was draped with the Confederate flag.
And let's see what's on the side here. This says, President John Tyler married first Letitia Christian, born November 12, 1790, died September 10th, 1842, interred at Cedar Grove, New Kent County, Virginia. Okay, I guess that was his first wife. Married second, Julia Gardner, born July 23rd, 1820, died July 10th, 1889, interred by his side under this monument. Okay, so she's here. She doesn't get a lot. I mean, she gets this little inscription back here, but she's interred beside him under this monument. And I wasn't expecting to visit this gravesite, but presidential historian Kurt Dion, who knew I was coming here today, reminded me that Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, the highest-ranking Confederate soldier during the Civil War, is laid to rest right here in the cemetery, and not very far from James Monroe and John Tyler. They're just up on the hill overlooking the James River, and he's down here sort of at the bottom of the hill overlooking the James River. It's a little strange. He died in New Orleans and was buried there in Monroe Cemetery, which is a cemetery I visited just a couple of weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. But eventually his wife had him disinterred and moved here to Richmond, Virginia, which I guess is considered the national cemetery of the Confederacy, which I didn't know. This is a huge historic cemetery, really beautiful, so many monuments, and I had no idea it had that kind of a history here. One of the things I find so interesting about cemeteries is that you find people you never expect to find buried next to each other.
This week I want to thank my newest channel supporters, Danny Proctor, Cliff Sheffield, and James Donnie Adair Jr. Thank you all very much for your very kind and generous donations to my channel. They're very appreciated.
So thanks for joining me once again on another road trip to the past. And until our next trip to the cemetery together, thanks for sharing the memories, everybody.